Lesson 7, Topic 2, the fatal blow to the United Nations, which is the Italian invasion and conquest of Abyssinia in 1935. Where and what is Abyssinia? You hear about it a lot, perhaps, if you study history, but it's a country that actually technically doesn't exist anymore. It's actually modern-day Ethiopia. At the time, Abyssinia was the last and only African territory that had not been conquered and colonized by a European power. It was ruled by an emperor, a man named Haile Selassie, who was, and it is revered as a god amongst the Rastafarians. Unlike Manchuria, on the other hand, Abyssinia, located where it is in the landlocked portion of the Horn of Africa, is of minor economic value at best. It has some mineral resources, but the overwhelming majority of the territory of Abyssinia is rocky wasteland, which probably accounts in great deal for the fact it hadn't been colonized. It's located between two of Italy's other, and in fact, Italy's only two, well, wrong, two of Italy's three colonies in Africa, that of Eritrea, which is a country that is still in existence today, to the north, and to the southeast you have Italian Somaliland, which was connected directly to the south to British Somaliland, which make up today what is mostly known as Somalia, unsurprisingly. And that's where Abyssinia is located. Abyssinia was always a sore spot for the Italians, a place that in Italian popular culture and lore had a particularly negative resonance for Italy. Italy had, before Mussolini, gone through sort of a cycle of wanting again to reestablish itself as a great power. And the Italian colonial government, which in fact was a democratic government, in 1896 tried to, in many ways, unify the people on a great colonial adventure by becoming the conquerors of African states, and invaded Abyssinia in 1896. The Italian army was humiliatingly defeated. In fact, it is the only time that an African country, without the support of a colonial power, in other words, the colonial power doing the fighting for them, was able to defend itself against a major European power. And in fact, this was the first defeat of a European country by an African nation since Carthage had defeated Rome during the Punic Wars, which, of course, you know of. Maybe if you remember back to the Treaty of Versailles and the concept of punitive peace, named after the Punic Wars of between Rome and Carthage, Hannibal, etc., etc. Anyways, this was 2,000 years of history. Europeans had never been defeated in Africa until this particular point. The Italians basically had been set on revenge since the humiliating defeat in Padua. World War I and Italy's participation in it was seen as a way of avenging disgrace. We know that the Italians left the peace conference early because they were so angered at the nature of the settlement that they got. So in other words, I suppose you can say World War I did not resolve these tensions within the Italian population. When Mussolini comes to power through a semi-hostile takeover in 1922, he and his fascist doctrine are all about war. It's an incredibly warlike ideal fascism. Fascism itself is literally a political philosophy without a lot of ideology. In fact, Mussolini will famously say that do not ask him for programs. He doesn't have programs. All he wants is something to the effect that of the best for the nation and to take this nation to where it needs to be in any way possible. I'm not going to talk about programs. Anyways, he basically says from a philosophical and doctrinal perspective, fascism, if it can be anything, is very much warlike. And the need to make your country great by conquering other countries, by expressing yourself militarily on another country, is really a core of fascism, hence why the militaristic countries of Italy and Germany find very much common ground in terms of their outgoing fascist militarism in advance of the Second World War. But Mussolini, of course, uses the Adowa as an example of the weakness of the government that came before him and how he will make it right and make it great again. Now, the Italian goals under Mussolini, of course, are based around expansion. Okay, he wants to recreate the power of the Roman Empire. He's also looking at this particular time in the mid-1930s for a diversion. Like every other country in the world, Italy was suffering under the consequences of the Great Depression. During the Great Depression and economic weakness, Mussolini's popularity, which was pretty high, started to go down. And for any fascist dictator, the worst thing that can happen is if your popularity goes down. Both Hitler and Mussolini both legitimized their power and held on to it to a certain degree because they ran effectively a personality cult. And in a personality cult, you could never be wrong. Now, things weren't going well in Italy. He needed to distract the people. Hence, war with Abyssinia really gives him a low-risk endeavor and excuse to do this. By 1935, he had started to create Italy back into a relatively important military power. Moreover, Italy was pretty disappointed. It didn't get a lot of Germany or Turkey's colonies in the peace treaties of 1919, so they didn't get anything in Africa, and as a result, they were a little bit, angry and wanting to get back in there. The Abyssinian army was equipped with outdated rifles. They also used spears and arrows. It should have been a pretty easy walkover for the Italians. The Italians had tanks, they had planes, they had poison gas, a lot of things that the Abyssinian army didn't have. The excuse for going into Abyssinia, and I'm hopeful at this point that you see a trend, was something known as the Wall incident. In November 1934, Wall, which is really nothing more than a rail junction near an oasis, a water spot in the middle of the desert of Abyssinia, near its border with Italian Somaliland, was found to be occupied by about 200 Italian soldiers. A British Boundary Commission, which was drawing the boundaries of what was then Italian and British Somaliland and what is then Abyssinia, was accompanied by about 600 Abyssinian soldiers. They stumble across the fact that 200 Italian soldiers are illegally occupying the rail station at Wall. And when they saw this, they noticed Italian soldiers were on their land, and the Abyssinians opened fire on them. The Italians then called in reinforcements, and the Italian aircraft came from Somaliland, bombing and killing 107 of the 600 Abyssinians who were there. Abyssinia called for the League of Nations help. They said that if the Italians had invaded their sovereign territory, that the League of Nations should arbitrate on this. They should step in and try and I don't know, make sure the Italians left. They shouldn't have been there. But of course, Mussolini refuses to leave. He blames the Abyssinians for the incident. He even demands compensation, much like he did in the Corfu incident of 1923. But you see here that really a staged border incident was used as an excuse to escalate the conflict, as had been done in Corfu, as had been done in Manchuria, etc., etc., etc. Now, Mussolini was supposed to be negotiating with the League, but spends the time between December 1934 and October 1935, when he eventually begins an invasion of Abyssinia, shipping his army to Africa, not doing any serious negotiating at all. Of course, he had wanted something like the Wall incident to come around to sort of enforce the legitimacy about what he was going to do. Britain and France find themselves in a very, very difficult position. At this particular time, we also know that Britain and France are starting to worry about Nazi Germany under Hitler. He's breaking the rules of the Treaty of Versailles. He's beginning to rearm. He's beginning to talk and look like a potential world war might be on the horizon once more, much to the chagrin, especially of the French. And they wanted to keep Italy, who was actually, up until this particular point, on relatively friendly terms with both of them, in their camp as a potential ally against Hitler. Mussolini had actually worked with the Allies in a lot of things. They had worked on the Kellogg-Briand Pact. They had worked on the Locarno treaties together. And they were able to, in this intermediate period between January and October 1935, sign something known as the Stresa Front. And it's a statement against German rearmament and a commitment to stand united against Germany. Mussolini took a very different lesson from the Stresa Front than the British and the French had. The British and the French basically saw this as a way of keeping Mussolini on their side, perhaps even preventing him from joining Abyssinia. For Mussolini, Stresa is a confirmation that Britain and France are prepared to accept giving him Abyssinia and not interjecting in the Abyssinian campaign he's about to launch, and is making no bones about the fact he's building up his military army on the borders of both North and South Abyssinia. And he sees that if he agrees to this, that is effectively them condoning his invasion of Abyssinia. Throughout the summer of 1935, though, British public opinion begins to turn against Mussolini. They see his aggression as negative, out of sorts, and start to put pressure on the British government to sort of work against Mussolini and to sort of get tough on him. So what we see in the summer of 1935 is British Foreign Minister Hoare speaking in the League of Nations about protecting Abyssinia and hoping that the League of Nations will make a strong stance against them. All of it really came to naught. Mussolini seizes on the opportunity presented by Streza to prepare for an attack. He launches a two-pronged invasion, and if you think back to where his colonies are located, you can imagine one prong from the north and another one from the south, meaning to converge on the capital of Addis Ababa and eventually capture Haile Selassie and win. Now, he launches this final attack in October of 1935. He does so without a formal declaration of war. It's a surprise attack. The invaders basically, it's absolutely brutal what the Italians do. They wipe out entire villages. They use poison gas, a weapon of war that was, in fact, Mussolini signs an agreement in 1923 saying that poison gas should not be allowed as a weapon of war. And here he is, only 12 years later, using it against the Abyssinians. The international condemnation of the Italian attack on Abyssinia was pretty much universal and widespread, especially once word of the poison gas attacks that the Italian army had used against the Abyssinians. So what does that mean necessarily for the League of Nations? And they really have a question of whether or not to put sanctions on Mussolini. It seems to be a pretty clear-cut case. You have a large and powerful nation like Italy attacking a smaller, not powerful whatsoever nation like Abyssinia. This is effectively exactly what the League of Nations existed to prevent. It's not Manchuria, it's not on the other side of the world, it's really close. Most of the European powers have armies and colonies very near Abyssinia. They could have interjected. Not only that, the Covenant of the League of Nations makes it 100% clear that sanctions must be introduced against an aggressor in this circumstance, and what they do, of course, in traditional League of Nations fashion, is they set up a committee to study the issue and to decide what sanctions to impose on Italy. Now, here are the considerations they have to have. Sanctions, of course, would only work if they were imposed quickly and decisively. Every week they waited after the Italian invasion, Mussolini's army would get stronger and stronger as he's able to bring more and more men to Abyssinia. And it would also mean that they would be less likely that the Abyssinians would be able, from any perspective, be able to turn around and defend themselves if they were mostly wiped out. So the longer they waited, the more impossible it would be to stop them. So what the League decides to do is they put in some pretty limited sanctions, okay? And I'll get to the reasons why they do this in a second. They limit arms sales to Italy, but that really wasn't a big deal because Italy manufactured their own arms anyway, so they never really imported them to begin with. They banned bank loans to Italy. They banned imports from Italy, so good luck trying to get Italian olive oil during the Abyssinian campaign. I shouldn't be so flippant about that, but you get the idea. Banned export of rubber, tin, and metals, which, of course, to some degree hurt the Italian economy because they did have to import these things to put, tires on their trucks, et cetera, et cetera. The League probably is more important for what it didn't sanction. The number one thing it didn't sanction was oil. They basically said, oil, the key resource for maintaining a mechanized army of tanks and airplanes, wasn't sanctioned. Basically, the French and the British started to fear that if they don't stop selling the Italians oil, the Americans are going to do it anyway, and then they'll have our market after the war. So they didn't want to lose that market. They didn't sanction coal, which is necessary for electricity, power, and heat, and all of those other things. Not only that, most importantly, coal ran the Italian factories and the smelters and the steel plants. And the British coal industry was totally dependent on, not totally, highly dependent on Italy. In fact, Italy brought in almost all of its coal from Britain. And therefore, to protect the 60,000 jobs, and that's actually the actual number that they thought they stood to lose if they put sanctions on Italy, Britain did not sanction coal. And most importantly, above all of this, is they didn't close the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal runs well, from the Mediterranean Sea all the way past the Italian colony of Eritrea. And it was the only way the Italian army could get to Abyssinia. But the Suez Canal, of course, is controlled by Britain and France, and they don't want to close this to Italian shipping. And the reason they don't do it is because Britain and France fear that closing the canal might lead to a war with Italy that they just can't be bothered to fight. So there's no will whatsoever to do anything militarily against the Italians. And the failure to close the Suez Canal meant Abyssinia had absolutely no hope of beating off Italy, no matter what it did. In the middle of all of this, things get even more complicated because the League of Nations response is so weak that the British and French sort of go rogue. Behind the scenes, you get British and foreign ministers, okay? You get British and French foreign ministers, Sir Samuel Hoare and Pierre Laval. And they prepare a plan to end the fighting. Their plan to end the fighting, not conducted in the League of Nations, is to divide up Abyssinia. Italy will get the best areas for agriculture, and Abyssinia, the country, will be left to the barren, rocky part that nobody wants, especially around the mountains. The plan, however, is leaked. It's leaked to the British and French press, and there's a huge outcry once this is made public by the population against a cowardly surrender to armed invasion. Hoare and Laval are forced to resign. Sir Samuel Hoare his career basically ends. Pierre Laval becomes a collaborator with Hitler and helps lead the Vichy government in France, and is, well, basically convicted of war crimes after the war for his complicity with the exportation of the Jewish population of France. So anyways, make the long story short in that regard, Hoare and Laval are forced to resign. In any case, let's be completely honest, even if they had got Mussolini to agree to the pact, or to listen to the pact, he wouldn't have accepted it anyways. Why would he accept a bit of Abyssinia when if he just stayed and fought for a couple more months, which was going quite well, he'd have the entire country to himself. By February 1936, he had already taken most of the country, and by May 1936, he had Addis Ababa, the capital. This episode really shows that the British and the French politicians were not willing to do anything effective to help Abyssinia whatsoever. And what this also does is when the Hoare-Laval policy collapses, it effectively ends any discussion of sanctions. Okay, and the sanctions altogether are dropped in 1936. The Americans become disgusted with the League's dithering and move to step up exports to Italy, and eventually Mussolini is allowed to keep Abyssinia. And the League of Nations backs off and does nothing. People just effectively give up on it. So why did the League fail to give any effective help to Abyssinia? And the major reason is that Britain and France, the two key cornerstones of the League, tried to pursue two pretty contradictory aims. Number one, there was to some degree a sense of duty-bound support for the League. In other words, they had to protect the collective security. This is why they put minor sanctions on Italy instead of more, which they were not inclined to do. So the fact that they sort of played lip service to the fact that they would do what the League wanted to do and try and hurt Italy a little bit and make them know that we're not too happy with you here. But most importantly, the reason why Britain and France don't get involved is they're fearful of offending Italy. They are more worried about German aggression, and they don't want Italy to become an ally of Germany. What unfortunately happens is this sort of dual policy actually backfires on them. And of course, their most important objective was that they didn't want Italy to ally itself with Germany. Okay, considering the circumstances of 1935, Hitler is the real threat, and they're willing to sacrifice the Abyssinians for a friend against Hitler. What happens in the end? They end up with nothing. The League of Nations is dealt a death blow. It basically ceases to exist as an organization, an effective organization in any form after this. On top of that, Italy is so offended that there were sanctions at all. Of course, he believed that he had been condoned in his actions in Abyssinia by the Stresa Front, that it makes common cause. It makes an alliance with Germany. It signs an agreement with Germany of mutual partnership known as the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. By 1939, Italy will join Germany in a military alliance known as the Pact of Steel. Italy itself will leave the League of Nations in 1937. And this really puts the Abyssinian crisis as perhaps the most pressing and damaging thing for the League of Nations. Hitler watches all of this and times his next moves very appropriately. He marches soldiers into the Rhineland on the 7th of March 1936 in complete defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. The French, desperate to get Italian support because they feared Germany, they had basically said, Italy, you can do whatever you want. Not only that, Germany knew that the League of Nations would not step up to them. It really sent a clear message there. The League then, after this, all of this gets ignored in most major issues of foreign policy after 1936. It plays little or no part in the negotiations around Anschluss, where the unification of Germany and Austria in 1938. It doesn't play any part in the Sudetenland negotiations of the Munich Conference of September 1938, where Neville Chamberlain negotiates a partitioning of Czechoslovakia and gives some of the German-speaking part of that to Hitler in agreement that there will be no World War II. There are no meetings of the League when World War II actually does break out, and when it meets again in 1946, it will be for the last time. Britain and France ultimately, after the Abyssinian crisis, realized that the only way to check Germany is to rearm, seek allies, and face it head on. You can't use the League of Nations, or at least the way the League of Nations will not be effective in helping them prevent German aggression. The historian's assessment of the League of Nations is pretty much unanimous when it comes to Abyssinia. They basically agree that the events of 1935 and 1936 are an absolute disaster for the League of Nations, and they have serious consequences for world peace. One of the most famous historians on the subject, or historians in general, of 20th century European history is a man named A.J.P. Taylor. And A.J.P. Taylor says, the real death of the League was in 1935. One day it was a powerful body imposing sanctions. The next day it was an empty sham. Everyone scuttling from it as quickly as possible. Hitler watched. I think after that, it's pretty self-explanatory that the League of Nations completely failed in Abyssinia, and that was the end of it.